Derek's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the glow of his boss's laptop casting shadows across her corner office. 11 p.m. on a single dad helping his CEO write the perfect dating profile. Her perfume lingered in the air between them, something expensive, something he had no business noticing. Caroline Reynolds leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his. What would you say makes someone worth loving again? The question hit somewhere he'd kept locked for 3 years. He typed words about vulnerability, about second chances, about a woman who deserved more than boardroom walls. When the profile was complete, she didn't click publish. Instead, she turned to him with eyes that held something far more dangerous than authority. Why don't you be the first one? 5 words. His wife's wedding ring still sat in his nightstand drawer. His 8-year-old daughter was asleep at home. And his boss had just changed everything. What happened next would test every boundary he thought he understood. 3 years had passed since Derek Holloway buried his wife, but the weight of her absence still pressed against his chest every morning when he woke up alone. The left side of the bed remained untouched, pillows arranged exactly as she'd left them, a shrine to a love that ended too soon. Cancer had taken her in 8 months. 8 months of hospital rooms, whispered prayers, and a little girl asking questions he couldn't answer. Now at 39, Derek moved through life like a man walking underwater, every step deliberate, every breath measured, every smile carefully constructed for his daughter's sake. His morning routine never varied. 5:30 alarm, coffee brewing while he packed Rosie's lunch, braiding her hair before school, a skill he'd learned from YouTube videos at 2 in the morning, fingers clumsy with grief but determined to give her some semblance of normalcy. His wife had made it look effortless. Everything about her had been effortless. Her laugh, her patience, the way she could turn any rainy afternoon into an adventure. Derek tried to be both parents, but most days he felt like he was failing at being even one. Rosie, at 8 years old, possessed a wisdom that broke his heart. She'd stopped asking when Mummy was coming back sometime during the 2nd year. Instead, she'd started leaving little notes in his briefcase, crayon drawings of stick figures holding hands, messages that said, "I love you, Daddy," with backwards letters and too many exclamation points. She pretended not to notice when he worked late. She never complained about frozen dinners or missed soccer games. She'd learned to shrink her needs to fit inside the empty spaces his grief had created, and that knowledge haunted him more than anything else. Work became his escape, his anesthesia, his reason to get out of bed when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. Derek had climbed the corporate ladder at Reynolds Marketing, not because he craved success, but because the office offered something his empty house couldn't: distraction. Spreadsheets didn't remind him of her. Conference calls didn't carry her scent. The fluorescent lights and sterile cubicles held no memories, no ghosts, no photographs smiling from every surface. He arrived early and stayed late, volunteering for projects no one wanted, burying himself in work until exhaustion finally granted him dreamless sleep. His colleagues had stopped inviting him to happy hours months ago. They'd tried in the beginning. Awkward condolences, casseroles left on his desk, offers to talk whenever you need. But grief made people uncomfortable, and Derek had perfected the art of polite deflection. He was fine, always fine. The word had lost all meaning, becoming a shield rather than a statement. Fine meant, please don't ask follow-up questions. Fine meant, I'm holding together with duct tape and denial. Fine meant, if I stop moving for 1 second, I might shatter into pieces too small to reassemble. Caroline Reynolds occupied the corner office on the 14th floor like a queen holding court. At 42, she'd built Reynolds Marketing from a 2-person startup into a company that commanded respect in boardrooms across the country. Her reputation preceded her: brilliant, demanding, impossible to please. She wore her success like armor, designer suits and perfectly manicured nails, creating a barrier between herself and everyone who might mistake her competence for warmth. The whispers in the break room called her the Ice Queen, and she'd done nothing to thaw that perception. Derek had worked under her leadership for 5 years, though under felt like the wrong preposition. Caroline didn't manage, she commanded. Her expectations were crystal clear and impossibly high. She remembered every deadline, every promise, every slight. Meetings with her felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded, never knowing which word might trigger an explosion of disappointment. Yet Derek respected her in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Behind the sharp edges and cutting remarks, he'd glimpsed something else. A loneliness that mirrored his own. A fortress built not from cruelty, but from wounds she'd never let anyone see. The night everything changed started like any other. Derek had stayed late to finish a presentation, the office empty, except for the cleaning crew's distant vacuum and the soft glow of his monitor. When Caroline's door opened, he assumed she was leaving for the night. Instead, she appeared at his cubicle, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Holloway, a word." Not a question. Never a question with Caroline. He followed her to her office, mind racing through possible mistakes, forgotten tasks, overlooked emails. The corner office looked different at night. Softer somehow, the city lights replacing the harsh daylight that usually flooded the windows. "Close the door." Caroline gestured to the chair across from her desk, but she didn't sit. Instead, she stood by the window, watching the city below, her reflection ghostly against the glass. The silence stretched until Derek's palms began to sweat. Then she spoke, and her voice carried something he'd never heard from her before. Uncertainty. "I need your help with something personal, and I need you to never speak of it to anyone in this building." Derek's confusion must have shown on his face because she turned, and for the first time in 5 years he saw Caroline Reynolds without her armor. The vulnerability in her expression startled him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Here was a woman who'd faced down hostile investors, weathered industry downturns, and fired executives twice her age without blinking. Yet something about this moment had stripped away every defense she'd built. Her hands, usually so steady during presentations, fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Her jaw, typically set with determination, seemed almost soft in the half-light. Derek found himself leaning forward, drawn into whatever confession was coming despite every professional instinct warning him to maintain distance. She pulled up a website on her laptop, a dating app, the kind with promises of meaningful connections and scientifically matched compatibility. "My sister's been nagging me for years. Says I'll die alone, surrounded by quarterly reports." A hint of self-deprecation cracked through her usual severity. "She set this up for me, made me promise to give it a real try." Caroline pushed the laptop toward him. "But I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to make myself sound like someone worth knowing. You're good with words, Holloway. Everyone says so." Her eyes met his, and in them, Derek saw something that looked remarkably like fear. The task felt absurd at first. Derek Holloway, widower and grief-stricken single father, helping his intimidating boss market herself for romance. But as they sat side by side, her laptop between them, something shifted. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 5 years began to dissolve, replaced by something far more dangerous: equality. They were just two people trying to navigate the impossible terrain of human connection, both scarred, both scared, both pretending they had it all figured out. "What do you actually enjoy?" Derek asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Outside of work, I mean." The question seemed to catch Caroline off guard. She tilted her head, considering it like a complex business problem. "I used to paint," she said finally. "Watercolors, mostly. Landscapes. I haven't touched a brush in years." Her voice softened at the memory. "My mother taught me. We'd spend Sundays in her garden, trying to capture the light on her roses." She caught herself, straightening. That's not something you put on a dating profile. Why not? Derek typed as he spoke. Someone who finds beauty in quiet moments, who learned love through art and patience. Caroline read the words over his shoulder, and he felt her exhale. Not a sigh, but something closer to release. You make me sound almost human. You are human. You just hide it well. The observation slipped out before he could stop it, and he braced for her sharp response. Instead, she laughed. A real laugh, unexpected and warm, transforming her face into something almost beautiful. That obvious, is it? She pulled her chair closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something sophisticated with notes of jasmine. What else? What else would make someone want to know more? They worked for hours, the city darkening outside the windows, the office growing colder as the building's heating system powered down for the night. Derek learned that Caroline had a younger brother she'd practically raised after their parents' divorce, that she'd worked 3 jobs through college, that she'd built her company from nothing, because proving people wrong had become her religion. With each revelation, the Ice Queen melted, revealing a woman who'd armored herself against a world that had given her every reason to expect disappointment. She wasn't cold. She was careful. There was a difference. Your turn. Caroline's words cut through his concentration. What? You know my secrets now. Only fair you share some of yours. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. You stay late every night. You never talk about anything personal. The other employees think you're a workaholic, but I've seen your face when you think no one's watching. Her voice gentled. What happened to you, Derek? No one had asked him directly. Not like that. Not with genuine curiosity rather than obligatory sympathy. The answer came before he could construct his usual defenses. My wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respectful. Caroline didn't offer hollow condolences or change the subject. She just waited, giving him space to continue or retreat. He continued. Her name was Michelle. We met in college. She was studying nursing, and I was convinced I'd be a novelist. A sad smile crossed his face. She believed in me even when I gave up on that dream. She made everything better just by existing. And then she didn't exist anymore, and I've been trying to figure out how to keep breathing ever since. His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away, embarrassed. You have a daughter. Caroline's statement was gentle. Rosie, she's 8. Derek pulled out his phone, showing her the lock screen. Rosie grinning at the camera, missing her 2 front teeth, wearing the princess costume she'd insisted on for last Halloween. She's the reason I get up in the morning. The only reason, some days. He tucked the phone away, surprised by how much he'd revealed. Caroline had a way of making silence feel like invitation. She's beautiful, Caroline said. She looks like she has your eyes. Then softer. Being everything for someone that small, that takes a different kind of strength than most people understand. The profile lay forgotten between them. What had started as a professional favor had become something else entirely. A confession. A connection. A crack in both their carefully constructed walls. Derek found himself noticing things he'd overlooked for 5 years. The way Caroline's hands trembled slightly when she spoke about her childhood. The slight southern accent that emerged when she forgot to control her voice. The vulnerability hiding beneath every sharp comment and impossible expectation. She wasn't a boss anymore. She was a person. A lonely, guarded, surprisingly tender person who'd spent her life convincing everyone she needed no one. Hours passed like minutes in that corner office. The cleaning crew came and went, their vacuum sounds distant and irrelevant. The city transformed outside the windows, rush hour traffic giving way to the slower pulse of evening. Then the contemplative stillness of late night. Neither of them suggested stopping. Neither wanted to break the spell of honesty that had descended upon them. When Caroline finally glanced at the clock and gasped at the time, Derek realized he hadn't thought about grief once in 4 hours. For a man who measured his days by the weight of loss, that absence felt revolutionary. "It's late." Derek glanced at his watch. "Nearly midnight. I should go. The babysitter charges triple after 11. He stood, suddenly aware of how close they'd been sitting, how intimate the darkness had made their conversation. Caroline stood too, smoothing her blouse, reconstructing the professional distance he'd watched crumble over the past few hours. "Thank you for this. Truly." She gestured at the laptop, at the profile that had become a pretext for something neither of them had expected. "I know it was an unusual request." Derek was almost at the door when her voice stopped him. "Why don't you be the first one?" He turned, certain he'd misheard. Caroline stood in the glow of her laptop, the dating profile still open behind her, and for once her expression held no pretense, no calculation, just raw, terrifying honesty. "The first one to what?" "To take me out. To see if any of those words we wrote are actually true." She crossed her arms, but the gesture looked defensive rather than commanding. "Unless the idea of dating your boss is too—" "It's not that." Derek's heart hammered against his ribs. His wedding ring had been sitting in that drawer for 3 years, a reminder of everything he'd lost, everything he'd sworn he couldn't feel again. "I have a daughter. My life is complicated. I'm not exactly prime dating material." "Whose life isn't complicated?" Caroline took a step toward him. "I've spent 42 years building something impressive on paper and empty in practice. I don't need prime dating material. I need someone real. Someone who understands that life doesn't follow business plans." She paused, vulnerability flickering across her features. "Someone who might understand me." The objections lined up in Derek's mind like soldiers ready for battle. She was his boss. He was a widower. There was Rosie to consider. The office politics alone could destroy his career. But standing in that corner office, with the city lights painting shadows across Caroline's face, none of those objections seemed to matter as much as the strange, terrifying hope blooming in his chest. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he admitted. "Date, I mean. I don't know if I remember how." "Neither do I." Caroline's smile was small but genuine. "Maybe we can figure it out together." He drove home that night in a daze, the highway lights blurring past like questions he couldn't answer. Michelle's face floated through his memory, not accusing, but gentle, the way she'd looked at him in their last days together, when she'd made him promise to live again. "Don't make me your excuse for avoiding happiness," she'd whispered, her hand thin and cool in his. "Promise me you'll let someone love you again." He'd promised. He'd lied. But maybe promises to the dying weren't lies. Maybe they were just truths waiting for the right moment to become real. The next morning found Derek standing outside Rosie's bedroom door, 2 cups of hot chocolate in hand, their Saturday ritual since Michelle's passing. Rosie sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and chapter books, her dark hair tangled from sleep. She looked so much like her mother that it stole his breath sometimes, the same curious eyes and determined chin. "Daddy has to ask you something important," he said, settling beside her. "Like, important? She clutched her favorite bunny closer, sensing the gravity in his voice. "You know how Daddy works a lot?" She nodded, and he saw the careful understanding in her eyes, 8 years old and already learning to protect his feelings. "Well, there's a lady at work. Her name is Caroline, and she asked me if maybe we could spend some time together. Like, outside of work. Like a date." The word felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from another life. Rosie considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Is she nice? She's complicated. Like Daddy, I guess. But yes, under all the complicatedness, I think she's very nice. Does she know about Mommy? Rosie's voice went small, and Derek's heart cracked along familiar fault lines. She does. And she knows about you too. I showed her your picture. He tucked a strand of hair behind Rosie's ear. Nothing is going to change how much I love you. Nothing and no one. You're always going to be my #1 girl. But I wanted to ask if it would be okay with you, if I tried to maybe not be so sad all the time. The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood. Rosie was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers working at the bunny's worn ear. Then she looked up at him with her mother's eyes and said something that nearly broke him. Mommy would want you to be happy, Daddy. She told me before she went to heaven. She said you'd be sad for a while, but that eventually someone would make you smile again. And when that happened, I should be nice to them. Tears tracked down Derek's cheeks before he could stop them. His 8-year-old daughter, carrying wisdom she should never have needed, giving him permission to feel joy again. I have one rule, though. Rosie held up a finger, her expression shifting to mock sternness. No phone calls during dinner. That's our time. Derek laughed through his tears, pulling her into a hug that seemed to restore something broken inside him. No phone calls during dinner. I promise. She hugged him back, her small arms surprisingly strong. And she has to like pizza. If she doesn't like pizza, it's not going to work. I'll make sure to ask, he managed. Very important qualification. The most important. Rosie agreed solemnly. Their first date wasn't candlelit dinners or expensive restaurants. It was a pizza parlor with sticky tables and a jukebox that only played 80s hits. Derek had insisted. If Caroline was going to be part of their lives, she needed to understand what that life actually looked like. No pretense, no corporate polish, just a widower, his daughter, and more napkins than any reasonable meal required. Caroline arrived in jeans and a simple blouse, so different from her office armor that Derek almost didn't recognize her. She looked younger, softer, terrified. The restaurant smelled of oregano and decades of family memories. Red-checkered tablecloths covered surfaces worn smooth by countless elbows, and the walls displayed photographs of Little League teams the owner had sponsored since 1982. This was Derek's sanctuary, the place he brought Rosie every Friday night, the place where the waitress knew their order before they sat down, the place where grief couldn't follow because the memories here belonged only to his new life as a father. Bringing Caroline felt like an invitation into something sacred. Rosie studied Caroline with the unfiltered assessment only children can manage. You're pretty, she announced. Are you mean? Daddy said you're complicated, and that usually means mean. Derek choked on his water while Caroline laughed, that same warm, unexpected sound from the night in her office. I can be mean sometimes, she admitted, but I'm trying to be better. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Your daddy helped me realize that being nice is more important than being impressive. Don't tell anyone at work, though. It would ruin my reputation. Rosie grinned, delighted by the shared secret. What's your favorite pizza? Pepperoni with extra cheese? That's my favorite too. Rosie turned to Derek with wide eyes. Daddy, she passed the test. The tension Derek hadn't realized he'd been holding released as he watched Caroline engage with his daughter, not with the patronizing tone adults often used with children, but with genuine interest. She asked about school, about Rosie's favorite books, about the stuffed animal collection that had apparently become legendary among her classmates. She listened, really listened, the way Michelle used to listen. Later, after Rosie had demolished 3 slices and excused herself to play the ancient arcade games in the corner, Caroline reached across the table and covered Derek's hand with hers. She's extraordinary, she said quietly. "You've done an amazing job." "I've done a terrified job," he corrected. "Every day I'm convinced I'm messing her up in ways we won't discover until therapy. Welcome to parenthood, from what I understand." Caroline's thumb traced circles on his knuckles. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're messing anything up. She's kind. She's confident. She gave her father permission to be happy. That doesn't come from failure." Derek turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. Such a small gesture, such a seismic shift. "I haven't held anyone's hand in 3 years," he admitted. "I'd forgotten how good it feels. How simple." "Simple is underrated." Caroline squeezed gently. "I've spent my whole career chasing complicated. Building complicated. Being complicated. Maybe what I actually needed was pizza with sticky tables and a little girl who tells me I'm pretty." She glanced at Rosie, now fully absorbed in some vintage video game. "Maybe what I needed was both of you." The rumors started within weeks. Office romance was impossible to hide, no matter how carefully they separated their personal and professional lives. Knowing glances, whispered conversations that stopped when Derek entered the break room. The assumption that he'd slept his way to favoritism, that his recent promotion had nothing to do with merit. He'd expected this. What he hadn't expected was how much it would hurt. The erosion of a reputation he'd spent years building, reduced to gossip and innuendo. But he could handle it. He'd survived worse. The hardest part wasn't the gossip itself. It was watching it affect Caroline. She'd worked twice as hard as any man in her industry to earn respect, and now every decision she made was questioned through the lens of their relationship. When she praised his work in meetings, colleagues exchanged knowing looks. When she defended his ideas, the whispers grew louder. She started overcompensating, being harsher with him publicly than with anyone else, trying to prove that favoritism played no part in their professional dynamic. The distance hurt worse than any rumor could. What he couldn't handle was Caroline's solution. She called him into her office one afternoon, and the professional mask was firmly back in place. "I've made a decision," she announced. "Effective immediately. You're being transferred to the Portland branch. Same title, same salary, different building." Derek felt the words like a physical blow. "You're sending me away?" "I'm protecting you." Her voice was steady, but he saw her hands trembling slightly against the desk. "The board is asking questions. HR is asking questions. If we don't put distance between us professionally, both our careers are at risk. So your solution is to make decisions about my life without consulting me." The anger surprised him, hot and sudden, erasing the soft feelings that had grown between them. "Just like you make decisions about everything else. Like I'm another employee you can move around on your organizational chart." Caroline flinched. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" He stood, pacing the office they'd shared that first night. "I thought we were partners. I thought we'd figure this out together. But the first sign of trouble, and you revert to CEO mode, make the hard calls, protect the bottom line, sacrifice whatever's necessary. I'm trying to protect you." Her composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "Don't you understand? I've never cared about anyone enough to worry about protecting them before. I don't know how to do this, Derek. I don't know how to be vulnerable and strong at the same time. I don't know how to lead a company and love someone and make sure the power difference between us doesn't poison everything." She pressed her hands against her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I always think I'm doing the right thing. That's the problem." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't find. Derek stood by the window where she'd first asked for his help, watching the same city lights that had witnessed the beginning of whatever this was between them. "You can't do this alone," he said finally. "That's the lesson I've spent 3 years learning. You can't carry everything yourself, control everything yourself, protect everyone by pushing them away." He turned to face her. If we're going to make this work, if there's any chance at all, you have to let me share the weight, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary. The answer came from an unexpected source. Rosie had overheard enough of their arguments. Phone calls that ended in frustrated silence. Dinner conversations that circled the same unsolvable problems. One evening, she appeared in the doorway of Derek's home office with her arms crossed and her mother's stubborn expression. "You and Caroline are being dumb," she announced. "Rosie, no, listen." She climbed into his lap with the confidence of someone who knew her opinion mattered. "When Mommy was sick, you tried to do everything yourself. Remember? You wouldn't let anyone help. And Mommy said that was silly. She said love means letting people carry things for you sometimes." Derek held his daughter close, marveling at how she could hold such wisdom in such a small frame. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You just don't listen." She poked his chest for emphasis. "Caroline is scared because she loves you, and you're scared because you love her. That's not a reason to be mad. That's a reason to try harder." She fixed him with a look that was pure Michelle. "Mommy would tell you to stop being stubborn and go fix it." "Would she?" "Definitely. She said you were the most stubborn person she ever met, but that you were worth it anyway." The next morning, Derek didn't go to his office. He went to Caroline's. She looked up when he entered, surprise and hope and fear chasing each other across her features. "I was given some advice," he said, closing the door behind him, "by a very wise 8-year-old consultant." He sat in the chair across from her desk. Not the power position, not the employee position, just a man trying to find the right words. "You're not wrong about the problems, but you're wrong about the solution. We don't fix this by running away from each other. We fix it by running toward." Caroline's eyes glistened. "I don't know how to run toward. I've spent my whole life running from." "I know. Me too." He reached across the desk, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. "But here's what I've learned from losing someone I loved. The time we have is never guaranteed. The career, the reputation, the approval of strangers. None of it matters if you're alone at the end. I spent 3 years protecting myself from ever feeling that kind of loss again, and all it did was make me feel lost every single day." She took his hand, that same small gesture, that same seismic shift. "I'll withdraw the transfer," she said. "We'll figure out the HR situation together. Transparently. Like partners." She squeezed his fingers. "I'm sorry I tried to control everything. It's the only way I've ever known to feel safe. I know. I'm sorry I shut down instead of fighting for us." He stood, pulling her up with him, and for the first time since their argument, they were standing together, literally, metaphorically, in all the ways that mattered. No more unilateral decisions about anything. Deal? Deal. 1 year later, Derek knelt on the beach at sunset, the same beach where they'd taken their first family vacation together. Him, Caroline, and Rosie, building sandcastles and collecting shells and learning how to be 3 instead of 2. Caroline had cried that weekend, overwhelmed by the simple joy of belonging somewhere. Now she cried again, but these tears caught the golden light as Derek opened a small velvet box. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "I never thought I'd want to. But you and Rosie, you've taught me that love isn't something you run out of. It's something that grows." Caroline sank to her knees to meet him, sand dusting her dress, mascara streaking her cheeks. "Is this really happening?" "Only if you say yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. A simple band, elegant like her, with a stone that caught light the way she caught his attention every time she walked into a room. "I know I come with complications. A daughter who will always come first. A history that sometimes weighs me down. But I also come with a promise. To be your partner in everything. To let you carry me when I'm too stubborn to ask for help. To carry you when you forget you're allowed to need someone. Yes. The word came out broken and beautiful. Yes to all of it. The complications, the history, the daughter who's currently taking photos from behind that sand dune. She laughed through her tears. Yes to you, Derek Holloway. Yes to being terrified and doing it anyway. He kissed her then, and somewhere behind them, Rosie cheered. She'd been in on the proposal for weeks, helping him pick the ring, suggesting the beach, practicing her surprised face in the mirror. This was her family too, and she'd fought for it as hard as either of them. The wedding was small, just close friends and the family they'd built together. Rosie served as flower girl, scattering petals with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred duty. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, she whispered loudly, "They better not," earning laughs that dissolved the last of the ceremony's formal tension. Derek watched Caroline walk toward him in simple white, her smile radiant, her walls finally fully down. She'd learned to stop hiding. He'd learned to stop running. Together, they'd learned that broken people could build something whole. The reception was held in the backyard of the house they'd purchased together, the first home Derek had bought since Michelle's death, the first place that felt like starting over rather than merely surviving. Fairy lights hung from the oak trees. A live band played the songs they'd discovered they both loved during those late nights in her office. Rosie danced with abandon, teaching Caroline moves that would never be graceful, but would always be joyful. Derek watched his daughter and his bride twirling beneath the stars, and he felt something he'd forgotten existed. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. In his wedding speech, Derek shared something he'd kept private for months. After Michelle died, I started writing. Not to publish, just to process. Late nights at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of grief. He paused, glancing at Caroline. Then I started writing about finding love again, about a complicated woman who asked a simple question that changed everything. He raised his glass. That story is being published next spring. It's dedicated to 3 people. Michelle, who taught me how to love, Rosie, who taught me how to hope, and Caroline, who taught me that the best stories don't end. They just begin new chapters. The book became a bestseller. Not because it was perfectly written, but because it was perfectly honest. A story about loss and resilience, about single parenthood and second chances, about 2 people who'd convinced themselves they didn't need anyone until they found each other. Readers sent letters, single fathers, widows, people trapped in grief who needed permission to live again. Derek read every one. Some nights, Caroline would find him crying at the kitchen table, overwhelmed by how much pain existed in the world. She'd sit beside him, hold his hand, and remind him that he was turning that pain into hope. 5 years later, their family had grown. The corner office now displayed 2 more photos, a toddler named Michelle, after the woman whose love had made all of this possible, and a newborn they'd named after Caroline's mother. Rosie, now 13, had appointed herself chief sibling supervisor, a role she took as seriously as her stepmother had once taken quarterly reports. The house was loud and messy and full of the kind of chaos that once would have terrified them both. Now it felt like home. Now it felt like everything they'd almost been too afraid to want. Sometimes late at night, Derek would stand in the doorway of the nursery and marvel at the distance between who he was and who he'd become. The man who'd buried his wife had believed he'd buried his capacity for joy along with her. The man who'd stayed late every night, hiding from his own life, hadn't dared to imagine this. A home full of love, a partner who challenged and softened him in equal measure, children who carried pieces of everyone he'd ever loved. He'd thought his story was over. It was only just beginning. The dating profile that started it all still existed somewhere in the digital ether, a document they'd created together in a corner office at 11 Pibar, searching for words to describe a woman worth loving. Caroline had never published it. She hadn't needed to. The person who would see past her armor, who would help her become someone softer without becoming someone less, had been there all along. Sometimes the love you're searching for isn't waiting to be found. It's standing right beside you, fingers hovering over a keyboard, ready to help you write the next chapter. Derek often thought about the man he'd been 3 years before, the hollow-eyed widower who counted the hours until he could escape into sleep, who measured his worth by how well he hid his pain. That man had believed love was something you could use up, like a savings account that depleted with every withdrawal. He'd been wrong. Love was more like a river. It kept flowing, finding new channels, carving new paths through the landscape of a life. Michelle's love hadn't ended when she died. It had transformed, becoming the foundation upon which everything else was built. Carolyn taught him that opening your heart again wasn't a betrayal of the past, it was a tribute to it. Every moment of joy they shared honored Michelle's memory, proving that her love had shaped him into someone capable of receiving love again. The wedding ring in his nightstand drawer had finally found its purpose. He'd given it to Rosie on her 16th birthday, along with the promise that somewhere out there, someone was waiting to love her as fiercely as her mother had loved him. The circle remained unbroken. The story continued. And sometimes all it takes is 5 words and enough courage to say them. Why don't you be the first one? The end.